Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth USBIA webinar of the year. Today's topic is supporting survivors of brain injury in a criminal justice setting. My name is Michaela Florian, and I'm the phone-based resource navigation program manager at the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado, and I'll be your host today. And then Liam Donovan is our presenter for today. If everyone could please stay muted throughout his presentation, we'd appreciate that. And then you're welcome to unmute at the end. We'll keep track of your questions in the chat if you think of anything throughout the webinar. Liam's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have around 15 minutes to open it up to you all for any questions and comments. And we'll also be sending out a copy of Liam's presentation, which will also be uploaded to the USBIA website, which is usbia.org. Liam, again, is our presenter for today, and he's the Criminal Justice System Program Manager at the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado. He oversees all of BIAC's work at the intersections of brain injury and criminal justice. Liam provides training to a variety of criminal justice entities on brain injury etiology, symptoms, and interventions, and supports these entities injury screening protocols within their organization. Liam has been working with the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado for 3 years and has nearly a decade of experience working with people with disabilities. Liam graduated from McGill University in 2015 with a bachelor's degree in psychology. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Liam.
All right, thanks so much, Michaela. I appreciate everyone for having me and for attending today's training. As Michaela mentioned, my name is Liam Donovan. I am the program manager for the Criminal Justice System at Brain Injury Alliance. This is my contact info up here. If y'all have any questions, after the training or would like more information, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to chat with you about some of the stuff I'm going to talk today. And, if you have any questions, again, please let me know. And then, yeah, I'm looking forward to answering all of your questions at the end of the presentation. So really quickly, just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm just going to talk a little bit about brain injury in the criminal justice system, some facts and figures, statistics, as well as some of the difficulties and kind of co-occurring issues that people in the justice system with brain injuries are going to be dealing with. And I'm going to talk a little bit about risk, need, responsivity, which is a central kind of tenet in the criminal justice system, how that overlaps with brain injury and kind of the ways that this theory and its practices can impact people with brain injuries. And then I'm going to talk about the Colorado Brain Injury Protocol that we have developed here in the state to kind of implement within these systems to identify people with brain injuries, as well as talking about some of the things that has gone really well for us in that domain, some of the challenges we faced, and some takeaways that hopefully you can take to your areas of work and expertise. So because the presentation today is geared towards the USBIA audience, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about brain injury as a whole and signs and symptoms and stuff like that. I'm really going to be focusing on brain injury as it relates to the criminal justice system. So first, I really just kind of want to show you the scope of this problem in context. A recent meta-analysis found that the prevalence of TBI in the justice-involved population was around 60%. So that's compared to about 8.5% in the general population. And is, when we look at kind of breakdowns of, groups of people, people in the justice system are one of the, kind of most overrepresented group of brain injury survivors. We also know that kind of the further up the food chain you go, for lack of a better word, through that system, the higher that number is going to be. So when you're looking at, juvenile folks in the juvenile justice system, people in kind of lower levels of the criminal justice system, probation, things like that, we expect to see a little bit lower number, probably not quite that 60% that we're talking about when we look at the population as a whole. And that's going to kind of increase as you move through that system. We would expect to see the highest rates of brain injury in the kind of state level prison facilities. So again, as you can see, a recent similar analysis found that about 30% of individuals in the juvenile justice system had a brain injury. There are also some different kind of features of this population that kind of contrast the general population. So when we look at the general population, typically men are much more likely to have a TBI than women, usually about 2 times more likely. However, when we're talking about the justice-involved population, that disparity is going to flip, and women are actually significantly more likely to have a TBI. Some studies have indicated that as many as 80% of incarcerated women have a history of brain injury. A lot of that is as a result of experiencing intimate partner domestic violence. And then again, kind of in contrast to the general population, the leading cause of TBI in the justice-involved population is going to be assaults rather than falls that we typically see in the US. It is important to note in this that we are still pretty early on in our understanding of kind of brain injury in the justice system, and is really kind of a new area of research. So there's still a lot about this population that we don't know. That said, there is research coming out every day that is kind of filling in some of those gaps of knowledge. So a while back in Colorado, the Brain Injury Alliance partnered with MindSource, the University of Denver, and a variety of criminal justice organizations throughout the state to do a study to kind of evaluate the representation of brain injury within these systems. So as part of this process, people were, inmates or probationers, people in these systems were evaluated for having a history of traumatic brain injury, using the Ohio State University TBI identification method, just something that I'm probably going to talk about a lot today. And then folks who screened positive on that were then given a subsequent neuropsych kind of screening, not quite a full-blown neuropsych evaluation, but more of a kind of slightly less intensive screen to again identify people who have a history of brain injury, and then of those folks, people who have some sort of ongoing impairment as a result of that brain injury. So just looking at the numbers that we found from that study, you can see that the numbers are pretty indicative of some of those kind of trends and statistics that I talked about earlier. As we can see here, the Denver juvenile probation, we had the lowest TBI rate or kind of rate of positive OSU screens at about 18.4%. And then again, looking at this female offender group in Adams County probation, 97% screened positive for having a history of TBI. And then again, we took those folks who screened positive, gave them a neuropsych screen, and kind of identified folks who are having some ongoing challenges related to that brain injury. And again, we saw that a very high number of those folks that had a TBI history were experiencing symptoms on an ongoing basis. One thing that we also found out about kind of some more specific information about those populations and the people who were identified as having a brain injury is that they have a lot of stuff on their plate, right? They are not just dealing with the criminal justice system and navigating that system. They're not just dealing with a TBI. They have a lot of other stuff going on that is going to complicate whatever recovery they are trying to attain, and make it a lot more difficult for these folks to maintain and kind of establish any kind of stability for them. So just looking at some of these areas that we identified, seeing childhood violence, adult victimization, suicide attempts, school suspension, history of substance misuse, mental health challenges, all of these are well above the number that we see in the general population. So someone who is coming out of jail or prison with a TBI is trying to maintain sobriety. They are trying to process childhood trauma. They're trying to keep themselves safe, all while navigating brain injury symptoms and trying to get through the kind of convoluted and really difficult to navigate system that is the criminal justice system. So then kind of in combination of that and information we know from other studies, people with brain injuries, again, have a significantly increased rate of trauma. They recidivate or return to jail or prison after being released at about a 50% higher rate than the general population. They're sentenced to longer sentences. They have higher rates of disciplinary incidents while they're incarcerated. Again, increased risk for substance abuse, mental illness, increased risk of experiencing homelessness. And ultimately, they are going to have really low treatment completion rates. So typically when we see someone that has this much stuff going on, this many challenges, someone that is not successful in trying to navigate some of this on their own, our typical response is that we are a lot of additional services, more intensive supervision, stuff like that. But unfortunately, we are not really accounting for the fact that these folks have a brain injury. And so it's going to be really difficult for them to kind of get anything out of that treatment and those interventions and those services because they're not adapted for their level of functioning given their brain injuries. So now I'm going to talk about risk need responsivity and brain injuries and kind of what that all means. So risk need responsivity is a theory of kind of intervention for people who have committed some sort of criminal offense. It's really a kind of central tenet of any sort of criminal justice system in the United States and really kind of across the world. The general kind of idea is that kind of each of these aspects of the theory are kind of overlapping and intersecting and kind of ultimately are, when used together in an appropriate manner, are going to reduce recidivism and keep people out of jails and prisons and kind of get them out of that revolving door of the criminal justice system. Excuse me. So the general idea is kind of, again, broken down into these three categories. We have the risk principle, which basically just means that we want to match the level of intervention to this offender's risk to reoffend. So, make sure that we are giving them the appropriate intervention to make sure that they don't commit more crimes. Then we have the need principle, which is basically just assessing these criminogenic needs or kind of indicators of likelihood to be arrested or commit offenses in the future. Kind of target those specific needs that we've identified in treatment and try and reduce them to reduce the recidivism rate. And then the third theory is responsivity, which is basically that in order to maximize the effectiveness of these interventions, we need to kind of tailor them to meet their needs, their skill level, their abilities to engage in these services and maintain their own stability. The extent to which this model and risk and need and all of that is used really varies depending on the jurisdiction you're in, the level of kind of criminal justice involvement that we're dealing with. And it can range all the way from, some states really just use this to kind of determine intervention level for folks that are on probation or folks that are being monitored while they're in the community as an alternative to jail or prison, or sometimes in addition to a jail or prison time. There are also states that will use risk assessment whether or not someone is provided or given bail or granted bail. So, whether or not someone is able to go back into the community while their case is being resolved. Some folks use it to determine whether or not someone should be released from prison. Places will use it to determine sentencing of someone that's been convicted of a crime. So again, this theory is really kind of the bread and butter of the criminal justice system. It's how most decisions are made. And is really essential to kind of understanding how these systems try to intervene and address someone's problematic behaviors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these things called criminogenic needs. So these are basically just kind of characteristics of folks that are thought to be predictive of someone's likelihood to commit some sort of criminal offense in the future. There are, some things that are static that don't change, such as, the age of first offense or first arrest or something like that. Gender, sex or things of that nature. And then there are other things that are considered a little bit more malleable, things that change over time, things that can be affected by interventions or treatment. But there are essentially 8 criminogenic needs that the system really focuses on. So I'm going to talk about the big 4, which are thought to be kind of the leading 4, and then the kind of next 4 is going to be on the next slide. But looking at the big 4, we have this kind of overall themes of low self-control, antisocial temperament, antisocial cognitions, and antisocial companions. So we are talking about antisocial in the context of these are things that are thought to are associated with problematic behaviors, committing criminal offenses, things of that nature. You'll also notice that a lot of these are also going to be kind of indicators of someone who might be dealing with a brain injury or some other sort of cognitive impairment. So as we mentioned, people with brain injuries are much more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. They struggle with maintaining the kind of conditions of supervision. So they are breaking rules of probation or parole. They are not maintaining sobriety or showing up for, mandatory groups or things of that nature. All things that are really common in people with brain injuries, people that struggle with memory impairments, things of that nature. So we have antisocial temperament, so people who are impulsive, adventurous, they struggle in a variety of different settings. So they struggle on probation, they aren't able to successfully complete treatment in jail. They're getting in trouble while they're in jail and prison and kind of do in those facilities. There's also kind of this sense of someone has a lack of empathy, anger issues, just kind of a general disregard for people around them, which is also a thing that is commonly attributed to people with brain injuries because of just some of their communication difficulties, anger issues that we can commonly see in people with brain injuries. So we have antisocial cognitions, people that have negative attitudes towards this justice system, people that are capable of or more inclined to rationalize their crime. They identify with folks who are also involved in the criminal justice system, things like that. And then we have antisocial companions, so association with other antisocial peers, and isolation from pro-social peers. So basically these folks are hanging out with not super great folks, or they are really struggling with maintaining relationships and friendships and kind of positive relationships with their pro-social peers who aren't likely to be involved in that system. Again, things that we frequently see in people with brain injuries, judgment issues, things of that nature can really get folks caught up with, kind of the wrong crowd, and kind of the lack of understanding and communication struggles that stem from a TBI also really significantly more likely to lead to someone isolating from others in their community. So we have the next 4. So these are family and marital issues, employment and education, pro-social recreation, and substance abuse. So as we mentioned, maintaining relationships, having a supportive family is a lot more difficult for folks with a brain injury because of some of their difficulties with symptoms associated with TBI. People with brain injuries are less likely to have, higher rates of employment, less likely to successfully complete education depending on the timing of their brain injury. They have difficulties finding activities that bring them joy and satisfaction. And then obviously substance use is a very commonly associated issue with people with brain injuries. So all of these things are kind of used to determine someone's risk of reoffending. And then if someone has a high risk for reoffending or, for committing an offense in the future, the idea is that we are going to match them with a very high level of intervention. So for instance, if someone is on probation, They have committed a crime, they have been sentenced to probation, and they have a very high risk profile because of, or in part because of a lot of brain injury symptoms that they're dealing with. The response to this from the system is going to be to kind of assign them to a higher intervention group. So officer more frequently. They're going to have more mandatory groups or therapy sessions that they're expected to attend. More likely to have more frequent UAs, other sorts of interventions and monitorings. Again, just kind of putting a lot more of a kind of closer watch on these folks. But you'll remember that a really essential piece of making sure that this is a successful model is the responsivity theory. So we need to be adjusting the services that we're delivering to the abilities of someone with or someone that is kind of involved in that system. However, brain injury knowledge is not super common in the criminal justice system or in professionals that are working with justice-involved survivors. There isn't a solid understanding that people in the justice system have a high rate of brain injuries, and a lot of folks that are involved in the justice system, they don't necessarily know that they have a brain injury. Typically, they're coming from more marginalized backgrounds that don't have access to as much healthcare or resources to support someone with a brain injury. Brain injury knowledge in the general population is still relatively limited and is more commonly associated with sports injuries and veterans and stuff like that. So the idea that this is something that is potentially affecting over half the criminal justice population isn't a very commonly known thing. So again, we are providing all of these extra requirements for them, all of these increased expectations of what they're going to be doing to maintain the conditions of their probation so that they aren't, sent back to jail or have their supervision revoked because of their inability to meet those requirements. Obviously, if someone is dealing with a brain injury and has a memory impairment, is struggling to find employment, struggles with substance use, having to attend multiple meetings, weekly, and keeping track of the UA lines that they have to call into to make sure or to kind of check if that's something that they have to do that day. All of that's going to be really difficult, and the system isn't necessarily accommodating those symptoms. And so when people struggle, it's not necessarily associated with the fact that they have a brain injury that isn't being properly accommodated for. It's that they are someone that has, antisocial attitudes, antisocial cognition, someone that, is kind of willfully choosing to, not follow the rules, someone that doesn't care about the law and kind of the expectations of them, rather than assuming or kind of thinking, this is someone that is lacking skills that I need to help them learn so that they can be successful in the community. These slides just again kind of point to the correlation between brain injury and some of these risk factors and criminogenic needs. So that is some of the challenges that we are trying to deal with and trying to kind of for these folks that are in this system. So what do we do now? As I mentioned, the understanding about brain injury and kind of the knowledge of brain injury in the system is relatively low. And it's also really low amongst the individuals that are kind of navigating that system, kind of experiencing those systems from the inmate, probationer, offender side. So, asking someone, do you have a brain injury, is not going to be an effective means of identifying those people. So what we in Colorado have done is develop something called the Brain Injury Protocol. Again, this was done in partnership with MindSource, NDU, kind of a product of that study that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, developed in conjunction with them to create some sort of formal protocol to figure out who these folks are, identify people that have a history of TBI, identifying what sorts of symptoms and impairments that they're dealing with, and then providing resources to the client, to the individuals that are providing services to them to make sure that they know that this person has a brain injury and needs these accommodations in order to successfully engage in treatment. So this is kind of a breakdown of how that process works. As I mentioned, we use something called the OSU TBI ID, so the Ohio State University Traumatic Brain Injury Identification Method. which we have found to be a really effective tool in a system with limited resources to identify people that are really likely to have ongoing impairment as a result of their brain injury, and hopefully not capturing some folks that maybe have a history of concussion or TBIs that maybe isn't experiencing ongoing impairment as a result of that. So first, someone is given the OSU TBI ID. Assuming that they are positive on that, they are then given something called a symptom questionnaire, which is really just kind of an inventory of self-reported symptoms that someone's dealing with, kind of put into real world terms. So do you forget your keys when you're leaving the house frequently? Do you struggle with managing your emotions? Do you have difficulty paying attention during long meetings? Do you forget what people are saying? Are you able to follow conversations? Things like that. Assuming someone is then, positive, they've identified that they have these ongoing impairments. There's a portal that folks can enter this symptom questionnaire onto, or the results into, and it automatically creates a series of recommendations for how to adjust our services for those folks. So this is the OSU TBI identification method. It is a really structured interview to, again, just try and identify those situations where someone is likely to have experienced a TBI. Because again, you can't just ask someone, do you have a brain injury? The number of clients that I've asked brain injury, and then you go through this form and you find out that they've had 6 concussions between the time they were 10 and 20, right? Obviously, that is someone that has a brain injury history and probably has some ongoing impairments as a result of that. So this is a really great way to kind of really piece out some of that information, some of those high-risk situations where someone is potentially likely to have sustained a brain injury. This is the symptoms questionnaire. Again, it is written in very real world terms, and kind of understanding that the folks that are in the justice system are likely to have a lower level of education. So it is meant to be kind of written at a reading language or reading level that most folks in the justice system should be able to follow and keep up with. Certainly, this is a kind of assessment that is really relied upon self-report. It isn't a kind of standardized metric. So it's important to note that none of this is going to be diagnostic. We are not going to be able to use this information to get someone Social Security or SSDI or something like that. It's really just meant as a way to figure out what folks probably have one, probably need some extra support with those symptoms. Make sure that people know, what sorts of resources are out there that they might be able to take advantage of. Again, this is the portal. It is really easy and simple to use. A kind of professional would come in, enter in all this information that this client has provided them about the symptoms they're experiencing, and it automatically generates a really fun and fancy email that provides the professional both a strategies guidebook. So this is meant to be a kind of more comprehensive book, guide for professionals that are working with people in the criminal justice system. It's specifically geared towards the ways that this professional can adjust their services. If they're a therapist, if they're a probation officer, these are ways that you can accommodate your client's memory challenges or ensure that your client is able to get all the information they need from your meetings, despite their inability to, or kind of their impaired ability to attain to information that's coming at them. Again, really focused on, how their practice can be adjusted really slightly to make sure that these folks know or are getting the services and supports that they need. It also provides a series of tip sheets, again, based on the symptoms that this client has endorsed that are really kind of broad and ways that this client can adjust things throughout their life, not just in therapy or probation, that can hopefully make this a little bit less challenging for them. So, ideas for managing memory problems, keeping track of important appointments, keeping all of your important stuff, phone, wallet, keys in one location, taking notes or bringing notes ahead of time to appointments so that you know which sorts of questions you want to ask. These are ways that you can more effectively communicate with your peers and ensure that your struggles in that area aren't burning bridges, straining relationships, things like that. And then again, depending on the results of that symptoms questionnaire, folks are then given something called the AHEAD psychoeducation curriculum. So this is a 7-week psychoed module, or 7-module psychoed group meant to kind of help clients develop a little bit of awareness that, of the ways that their brain injury might be impacting them that maybe they don't realize. Figure out ways to identify those symptoms, figure out when they're showing up, identifying triggers for those issues, and then really kind of helping them learn to manage some of those behaviors on their own. It's really discussion based and kind of participant focused. So it's a lot of kind of them, the clients, the survivors in that group, helping each other figure out ways to navigate these symptoms. And kind of figure out how they can advocate for themselves in these systems that aren't necessarily designed to accommodate their needs. It is a open source, curriculum. It doesn't require any sort of credentials or education requirements. So it can be provided in a variety of settings by a variety of different folks, interns, peer support professionals. It doesn't have to be a licensed clinician. And we have found that it's really effective. Clients get a lot out of it. They feel heard and seen and understood. And, remember that for a lot of these folks, they didn't know that they had a brain injury. They are someone that their whole life they've been labeled as a screw up, an idiot, slow, just a general kind of bad apple. And all along, there was this brain injury that was kind of causing some of these negative behaviors that was, getting in the way of them being able to maintain the stability and kind of achievement that is necessary to stay out of these systems that, once you're in, it's really tough to get out of. So just kind of the insight and understanding and kind of self-knowledge that comes from this, that in itself can be super effective in really just kind of changing the way that these clients look at themselves and kind of understand who they are. So my job at the Brain Injury Alliance is really to go to criminal justice sites and train them on implementing this protocol, train them on, brain injuries and best practices for navigating, helping them figure out ways to implement these accommodations into their practice and into the systems and the settings that they are working with clients. So this is probably a not comprehensive list of all of the partners that have taken on providing this protocol in a criminal justice setting. The blue flags are jails. So we partnered with jail-based behavioral health services or programs within the jail that are providing mental health and substance use supports for clients that are struggling with that. And then the orange flags are probation departments. So again, folks who are not in jail, they are not incarcerated, but they are still under criminal supervision and oftentimes still at risk for getting sent to jail or prison as a result of struggling to meet the needs of probation. So as you can see, a lot of our work has been kind of focused along the Front Range where most of the population of Colorado is located. But we have been able to expand to some of our more rural areas of the state, places that have a significant lack of resources, places where folks are less likely to have, potentially they've been identified along the way throughout their life that they have a brain injury history. We have, again, heard really great feedback from the places that have implemented this protocol into their practice. They've found it to be really helpful. It's a great way to, again, quickly identify folks that are going to need some extra supports and a little bit of accommodation to ensure that they're able to be successful. So while that is, the kind of protocol that we've put into place, it is, something that we're really proud of. We're super happy with the work that we've put in. There have been some challenges along the way for sure. So the first of those, and probably chief among them, is that the criminal justice system is a really massive system. And massive systems are really slow to adapt to change. So finding a way to implement this, at a large scale has been really difficult to do. Because Colorado is a very diverse state in terms of the settings that people are kind of entering the criminal justice system. We have big major metropolises like Denver, up to Fort Collins, Colorado Springs, big cities that have a lot of different resources. And then we also have rural and frontier communities where maybe there is one treatment provider in the entire county for someone with mental health issues or something like that. So finding a way to implement them in each system, in each of these locations has to be adjusted depending on what they're able to provide, the types of resources they have to do that, stuff like that. So, really excited and eager to take this on. Finding ways to implement that on a larger scale has been a challenge so far, but definitely something that we're making progress towards. Another is going to be red tape. So obviously this, because this is a very large system and it's a government system, there are a lot of levels of bureaucracy along the way. So while there may be a treatment provider that is providing jail-based behavioral health services that is super excited and eager to take this on, they might not necessarily have the final call over if that's something that they're able to do, right? That might have to go through several layers of city attorneys and county supervisors and sheriffs and things of that nature, that might not have as good of an understanding of what people need on the clinical side of things as these treatment providers. So trying to navigate those systems in a way that is kind of delicate and not burning any bridges, but still getting stuff done can be really challenging. But again, it's something that we have found ways to work through and is something that we've still had a lot of success in spite of. So another issue that we see a lot is just the way that information is kind of siloed in these systems. So for someone who is sentenced to or arrested and charged with a crime and ultimately sentenced or convicted and sentenced, there are several different entities that they are moving through. You have the police departments, you have the courts, you have probation departments that again are separate from the courts, you have jails that are separate from the probation departments. And so even if someone is identified in one stage as having a brain injury, and someone that needs these accommodations, that information isn't always necessarily translated or transcribed to the next system that they're entering as a part of their sentence. So someone might be identified in jail as having a brain injury, needing these supports, needing these accommodations, and then they are released from jail. They have to finish their sentence on probation, but that information doesn't get communicated to the probation officer. So if someone has learned all of these new skills in jail, or at least kind of identified the extent to which these challenges might be in their life, if that information isn't transcribed to the probation officer, the therapist that they're working with in the community, we're still kind of at that same place where they're having a lot of intervention, a lot of services put around them, but they're not accommodating for the symptoms that this person's experiencing. So it's going to be a lot less effective. Folks are going to be more likely to incomplete treatment or to not complete treatment, and are going to be more likely to recidivate. Another thing that we kind of struggle with is kind of an us versus them mentality. Kind of depending on where you're at, professional you're interacting with, there is still definitely in a lot of places a sense of people in jail, people on probation are criminals. They need to be protected, or the community as a whole needs to be protected from these people, and really kind of erases some of the human side of them, right? So it isn't necessarily the case that someone is seen as a flawed person that has a lot of stuff on their plate that they really just need help kind of dealing with and keeping track of and managing. And we find that when people kind of approach these situations as this person is a criminal that is choosing not to successfully complete treatment, they're not engaging in probation the way we expect them to, it's more likely that we're going to respond to them with punishment and kind of more punitive and restrictive measures. Whereas if we approach this of this person is struggling to show up to probation because they have a memory impairment and it's really tough for them to keep track of their appointments, maybe we can figure out a way to kind of give them the skills that they need to at least show up on time. Maybe that isn't necessarily going to keep them from committing crimes in the future, but we know that they're at least not going to get sent back to jail because they're missing probation appointments. So kind of changing that mentality and trying to get folks to approach this from a place of learning and teaching and growth rather than punishment, again, is a challenge that we're trying to deal with. And then, of course, there's resource availability. I'm sure all of you know, we live in a world with very finite resources, especially for folks that have a history of criminal justice involvement. It's going to be more difficult for them to find housing, employment, all sorts of things that are going to be really important for them maintaining stability, them recovering or accommodating their brain injury. And so, even if we're able to identify folks with brain injuries, provide these accommodations, if they're still not able to meet their basic needs because of a lack of resources in the community, it's going to be tough to keep them on their feet, and it's going to be tough to keep them out of jail again. So, a lot of effort definitely needs to be put in making sure that these folks still have the ability to survive despite some of their impairments or histories. And then one thing that we have found to be immensely helpful is some sort of kind of state level connection. The Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado has a really great working relationship with MindSource, who is our state brain injury program, kind of administration. They are responsible for managing the program and the funds of the brain injury kind of trust fund, and have been an excellent resource at identifying, state agencies that want to implement this within the criminal justice system. Applying for grants and funding to ensure that we're able to implement these systems in as many places as possible. State level backing has made it a lot more, easy and just generally kind of smoother at navigating some of these relationships. So having folks that can kind of make those connections, can kind of grease the wheels of bureaucracy. People that know how to kind of speak in the language of these systems that don't always make a lot of sense has really been essential to our success and to the success that we're hoping to have moving forward. And kind of that note, I know that there is a lot of work being done at the federal level. NASHIA, the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, or some other acronym that I maybe am butchering. They have, again, kind of transferred a lot of that knowledge and trying to make that available to more states so that more places can implement similar systems or protocols within the organizations that they are working with. So if you are able to kind of identify champions at the state level that really want to see this work progressed and move to the next level, that's going to make your job a lot more easy. And that is just about all I had. We have, just about 15 minutes left for questions. I see that the chat box has been ticking up the whole time, but if anyone has questions for me about our work, the criminal justice system as a whole, things like that, please let me know.
Great, thank you so much, Liam. That was a lot of great content. I'm gonna just start at the top of the chat here for some questions. So the first one is Janice. Do you screen for ACEs?
Adverse childhood experiences, for folks that maybe don't know. It is not something that we do as part of this protocol. That is something that is, depending on where you're at in the system and stuff like that, that happens a lot already in those systems. So typically most people have some sort of screening for that when they're, taken into jail or when they start probation. So that is not necessarily something that is specific to this protocol, but is something that is pretty widely done across the criminal justice system.
Great, thank you. Scott is asking, who is best to administer the AHEAD curriculum? How did you determine this?
So yeah, as I mentioned, it is open source and doesn't have any sort of education requirement. I mean, I think really the what you really need to have to successfully do that is, or to successfully run that curriculum is, a solid understanding of brain injury. There's a lot of detail on that about brain injuries and what causes them and symptoms associated with that. But there are usually a lot of questions beyond that knowledge. So I had this happen to me. Is that considered a brain injury? Or this is a symptom that I experience from time to time. Do you know of else? So having a good understanding of brain injury in general can really help kind of head off some of those questions and make that a little bit more informative. And then another thing that can be really helpful is just a good understanding of how symptoms of brain injury can show up in a group setting and ways to kind of manage that. So understanding that communication difficulties are pretty common with people with brain injuries, that there's delayed processing speeds and things like that are really going to impact the ability to kind of keep the group flowing and keep people attending to the information. So having a good understanding of how to accommodate for those symptoms in a group setting is going to be super important. But beyond that, really anyone can deliver this curriculum. Again, it's all open source, so you don't need to sign any contract or anything like that. You can just get that information and provide it for the people that need it.
Thank you. Sandra is asking, how have judges and prosecutors looked at this program?
That is, again, something that is really dependent on the judge and the prosecutor, and kind of where you're at in the system. As you saw in a lot, or in the early phases of this study that we did a few years back, a lot of the kind of entities that we did them were in so-called recovery courts, or specialty courts. So these are courts that exist for people with specific challenges. Veterans court is for obviously people who are involved in the justice system that have served in the military. Drug court for people that are routinely getting in trouble for substance use related issues. We have definitely identified some judges in that system and through this process that are all aboard. They really want this information because they're seeing the same people come in for the same thing over and over and over again, and really want to make sure that these people have the resources they need to stop coming back to their court and stop getting in trouble and committing the same crimes and getting the same sentence. So those folks have certainly been champions of some of this information. I have myself not worked as closely with the judges in our state, just because a lot of our focus since I've taken on this position has been in kind of probation and jail department, or probation departments and jails. But certainly there have been a few champions. There's always going to be some people in these systems that are skeptical or maybe not as compassionate as we would like to see. But we certainly think that there is, hopefully building some sort of kind of critical mass of understanding that, we kind of tackle one judge, one prosecutor at a time until eventually most of the system knows that this is an issue that needs to be considered when we're working with these folks.
Great, thank you. And then Scott is asking, how did you get initial buy-in to implement this continuum? Did you get agreement for the full screening through RF, or did you have to integrate each portion separately as the system allowed?
So again, that really depends on what system we're dealing with and the capacity that they have. One thing that we have run into a lot is organizations don't have providers to provide the AHEAD curriculum. Their clinicians are working basically like 10-hour days back to back to back. Probation officers are incredibly overloaded, so they just didn't have anyone that could run these groups. That said, we didn't want that to be a barrier to these people being identified and accommodated for. And so, while we encourage everyone to try and implement every aspect of this protocol, It certainly is not the case that everyone is able to. And again, we want to make sure that we're at least spreading this knowledge, figuring out who these people are that have brain injuries and making sure that if nothing else, they know they have a brain injury, they know the kinds of symptoms they're dealing with, and are able to connect to other resources in the community, like the Brain Injury Alliance, that can maybe kind of supplement what they're not able to provide. And in terms of buy-in and kind of getting buy-in, again, that's the thing that really kind of depends on where you're at in the system, but finding someone who can be a champion for this and advocate for implementing it and seeing that it's successful is a really important piece of that. It's really tough to come into an organization and say, hey, I know you have a full plate already. Here's an additional set of screenings that you need to do for every client that comes through your door. Doesn't make us super popular. People don't always like to be given more work, especially if they don't know why this work is being done. And so having someone that is in that organization that can say, hey, yes, we're doing more work up front, but this is hopefully going to save you time down the road because you don't have to repeat the same thing with the same client over and over and over again, because we've accommodated for the fact that they have a memory impairment or an attention impairment, and we can kind of work through that together. So finding someone in these systems that really wants to champion that and kind of get everyone on board is super important. And then I think there was a question about kind of chunking and finding certain places to implement certain things. The probation system in particular is one that relies on contractors and outside providers. And so there have been instances where we were not able to get the probation department to sign on having their probation officers or their staff do this screening, but they were able to identify a treatment provider that wanted to. They were the ones that were doing the screenings, and again, transmitting that information so that the probation officer is still aware, still able to implement those accommodations in their work together.
Getting quite a few questions. We'll see if we can get to all these. Corey is asking, who administers the OSU TBI ID questionnaire to probationers? Is it the probation officer? If so, does the PO have any special training in TBI related issues, or are they regular probation officers?
So yeah, again, that really depends on where you're at, what type of organization we're working with and the capacity that they have. Usually, maybe not usually, but it is something that we encourage probation officers to do, or treatment providers. Again, really kind of depends on what they have the capacity for. But as a part of this process and implementing this protocol, everyone gets a very intense training on what brain injuries are, what these tools look like, how to use them, kind of red flags to look out for, things that might pop up that you should be aware of. Things like that. So while they are probably not going to be brain injury experts or specialists of any sort, they're someone that has at least been given the information that they need to learn more about this, or be able to at least say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question. Here's what I can tell you. Here's where I can point you to if you need more information or need more support kind of figuring that out.
Sandra is asking, wouldn't that come out in the pre-sentencing report? I think that was pertaining to a particular slide maybe you were on. And then she says, some states are now starting to abolish bail during the arraignment, so they're released ROR. How are they monitored under a program under their next court appearance for possible trial, either a bench trial or jury?
So again, that would really kind of depend on the system that you're operating in. So yeah, a lot of states are moving away from cash bail, and instead just sending people out on recognizance bonds, or basically just saying, hey, you promise to show up for your court dates. That's not something that we really have a big part in. That is not really a world that we have a lot of sway in. But in an ideal world, everyone knows that this person has a brain injury. Their attorney staff knows that this person is someone that is potentially at risk for forgetting court dates and not showing up. So implementing reminders. I would love if we could just set a blanket rule that everyone gets a text message the day before their trial or court date. But again, there's certainly a lot of considerations there. not something that we have a ton of say in, and certainly, you know, I'm not, you know, someone with a brain injury should be kept in jail just because they're, you know, they could potentially forget their court date. But certainly if we are providing them accommodations, it's hopefully not going to be as big of an issue.
Janice had a comment, the OSU screening can be given by anyone. There's tutorials online demonstrating administration. And then we have a question from Sue. OSU TBI ID is great for teens. Is there any tool for youth 10, 11, 12, or cognitively challenged younger teens for screening?
There are. I am not as well versed in that because I more often deal with the adult side of things. But I have a slide that didn't make the final cut. I think it's the brain check survey. Is one that is commonly used when dealing with youth. So that is certainly one that is available. I know that youth screenings are something that there is more effort being put into identifying them. So I don't have a lot of that information off the top of my head, but there are certainly brain injury history screenings out there that are specifically for youth or younger adults or perhaps more cognitively impaired adults that might not be able to complete that on their own.
Thank you. June is asking, do you have outcome data related to those that have completed the AHEAD curriculum and reduction in recidivism rates?
So we don't really. Oops. There is Satan gets low on battery. There we go. Didn't want to accidentally die on you all. We do not have a lot of information about outcomes yet because Hey, Kayla, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Okay.
you now.
Sorry about that, everyone. My internet was just cutting out.
Oh, okay, no problem.
So we don't have a lot of outcome data yet. Again, this is still a very kind of early stages project. And on top of that, recidivism is a really difficult metric to track. As I mentioned, we have a lot of different systems, none of whom communicate with each other. So while we might be able to figure out, you know, does this person end up back in that same facility? You know, does someone who is released from jail in Denver end up back in a Denver jail? It would be a lot more difficult to figure out if, you know, does someone end up back in a Jefferson County jail? And so that has really been and continues to be in a lot of areas a kind of limiting factor for determining the success rate of programs. So unfortunately, we don't really have that information available. Anecdotally, I would like to think that it is having some sort of impact, but I think that we are also really trying to emphasize is that we are hopefully seeing that these folks are, you know, maybe they are, you know, ending back up in jail or something like that, but we're at least giving them the tools that they need to get out of, you know, the system to effectively complete probation, and at least try and give them the push that they need to kind of get out that door.
Okay. And I think this will probably be our last question. And then we have a comment. Sandra says, Liam, are you attempting to screen every defendant in every court in Colorado? Are they put in protective custody?
So we, I mean, in an ideal world, brain injury screening would be a, you know, mandatory part of any sort of entry into the criminal justice system. You know, probation, jail, prison, you know, pre-sentence proceedings and stuff like that. At the moment, that I think is an unrealistic goal, at least in Colorado, in the near future, I should say. You know, I think it's something that, given the rates of brain injury that we are seeing, that is something that we probably should be doing. That said, that requires a lot of resources that don't exist, a lot of political appetite for kind of pushing some of this change that is hard to come by. And again, as I kind of mentioned, it needs to really be tailored towards the setting that we're kind of working in. And doing some sort of one-size-fits-all approach for a system as big and convoluted as the criminal justice system is probably not going to be really effective. And if we are not effective in trying to implement it, then these sorts of changes aren't going to stick. And so we're not going to see long-term success in getting folks to screen for brain injury because it was tried and didn't make sense in the place that we tried to implement it. So I think that is certainly a goal that we should be working towards, but there are a lot of steps in between now and there.
Okay, and then Sandra's comment. And one last thing I thought of, what about those represented by public defenders who have no time, very heavy caseloads, and usually only spend about 15 minutes per client in court? Sometimes it's just a meet and greet. They read the brief of the charges and tell the defendant to plead not guilty and get a future court date. Not a good idea. Sometimes effective assistance of counsel.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly an issue within the justice system. Public defenders are super overworked and under-resourced, and in an ideal world, we could give them the time and resources they need to provide a thorough defense for all of their clients. One thing that we have found to be helpful is, again, kind of going into those departments, identifying or getting in front of public defenders and saying, all right, maybe you don't have the time to do a full OSU screening and symptom questionnaire on this person. But here's some red flags to look out for. Are they getting in trouble for the same thing over and over again? Are they primarily here because they're struggling on probation? Those sorts of things that is potentially a red flag that this person might need or might have a TBI, and that could be kind of at the heart of some of these behaviors. And then, hopefully trying to get them the resources they need to follow up on that. Definitely, it is not something that is going to be an easy thing to do. And it's also important to note that, again, the information that we're getting from this protocol isn't something that can really be used in a forensic capacity. So an OSU screen and a symptom questionnaire can't say that this person committed a crime because of their brain injury. And so the extent to which it is going to change the outcome of that trial or case is, maybe not necessarily there, but it's something that we could at least hopefully, kind of stop them from getting in more trouble throughout the process of that court proceeding. So, they're not missing appointments, they're not, having explosions or things like that in a courtroom and getting in more trouble aside from their initial charges. And then in terms of protective custody, I think we certainly see that is something that used in people with brain injuries as a means of just kind of separating them from the general population. Again, a lot of these folks are struggling with, anger management and impulsivity issues while they're incarcerated. So they're getting into fights, they're getting in more trouble. Oftentimes, isolation or protective custody or some sort of segregation from the general population is an outcome of that. I know that there's been a lot of work kind of at the state level to hopefully make brain injury screening a part of that process so that folks who have cognitive impairments are not, just locked up in, protective custody for days at a time, and instead, are given some maybe more appropriate interventions to try and address some of those behaviors.
Great, thank you so much, Liam. For
Yeah,
presenting, and thank you everyone for being so engaging in the chat. Just a reminder that this content will be emailed out and also uploaded to the USBIA website. And then if anyone has any follow-up questions, Liam had put his email up. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. And yeah, hope you all have a great day and a good Veterans Day tomorrow.